I'm Andrew Russeth, the editor of Artnet Pro. Every day, I have the thrill of working with award-winning journalists, critics, and columnists who are on the ground at art fairs and auction houses, artist studios, and gallery back rooms. They report as important new art comes into view and as high-risk deals get done, or come undone in some cases. The Artnet Pro team breaks news and provides expert analysis of the fast-changing art industry, the kind of journalism that takes time, dedication, and resources. If you subscribe to Artnet Pro, you're helping to make that happen, so thank you. If you would like to support us, please subscribe at news.artnet.com/subscribe.
For our civilization, I would like to see us get a bit more comfortable with other civilizations living by their own values, even if we're not into those values. I think we haven't had to think like that.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. The new museum in New York opens its new building this week, and it's doing so with a big show called New Humans, Memories of the Future, about how artists have rethought what it means to be human through technology. It's a topic on a lot of people's minds right now. And among the many artists whose visions feature in this important show is Christopher Kulendran Thomas. Kulendran Thomas has a lot going on. Aside from the new museum, he's got another video installation up at the Museum of Modern Art right now. Well, last fall, his work Peacecore showed at Gagosian Gallery in New York. He also runs a buzzy project space, Earth, on the Lower East Side and in Echo Park, Los Angeles. Kulendran Thomas's works are complicated. They often feature paintings inspired by AI-generated images. His video installations at MoMA and at the new museum involve deepfake interviews with celebrities like Taylor Swift, Kim Kardashian, or even other artists, together with documentary footage about Sri Lanka, where his family is from. Beneath all these complex parts about political systems, philosophy, technology, human creativity, post-human creativity, and where we might be heading in the future as artists and as a civilization. Christopher Kulendran Thomas, thank you for joining me on the show.
Great to be here, Ben.
So I have so much to talk to you about, and thank you for your time, because you're sort of having quite a year, and you're on a bit of a world tour, if I understand it. Where are you now?
I'm in London.
What are you doing there?
I technically live here, though my studio's in Berlin.
I see. You are the paradigm of the post-national artist. I guess we'll get into that. You are an artist of big ideas. You are featured in this new museum show, New Humans, that's opening this week. But I do want to give people a sense of where you're coming from, because it's really important to your work. So how did you decide to become an artist? What interested you when you were coming up?
I kind of didn't. I didn't ever want to be an artist. I didn't even know it was a thing you could be, because I didn't grow up with art or going to museums or even studying art in school. I had more of a kind of, I guess, engineering mindset. I was really into like taking things apart and seeing how they work. But I started making stuff kind of at the very end of my childhood, and initially kind of out of desperation, because I had a debilitating stutter. I couldn't speak all through my childhood. And it wasn't until I started making things that I got the confidence to be able to teach myself to speak. And first it was photography, which was easy for me as this kind of like, I guess, reactive mechanical way of making things. But yeah, that somehow gave me the confidence to reverse engineer how speaking works. And I had to literally like train myself. I had to sort of take apart how this thing that most people do naturally, to take apart how that works. And since then, I've been kind of obsessed with painting as this kind of iconic form of self-expression, but terrified of doing it, because making a mark with my own hand had always filled me with the same kind of terror that I'd used to get when I'd open my mouth to speak and nothing would come out. It's exactly the same kind of physical experience. So I eventually kind of came to painting through a more kind of circuitous way of approaching it.
Systems. Yeah. I mean, you have a very peculiar way of thinking. That's interesting. You say you came at it through engineering. You went to Goldsmiths in the early 2010s. What kind of theories interested you there? What was the mood in art school at that time?
A bunch of interesting characters around. Suhail Malik was doing the kind of theory component. And with Suhail, I got interested in this idea of understanding contemporary art, not simply as whatever was being made at the time, but as a kind of historically specific genre of art that we call contemporary. And to me, that made so much sense because kind of where my family is from, in Sri Lanka, it's much kind of maybe easier to see than it is in the centers of where the Western canon is defined and transmitted from. From the peripheries, it's maybe easier to see what that canon does and how it operates as a kind of cultural expression of a particular way of organizing economies and a particular kind of like set of values from the West.
Yeah. Like I was going to ask you about that. Your first stuff that you did right out of art school, When Platitudes Become Form, it really kind of made your name very early on. It's interesting because it's about painting and the canon and stuff, but it is a systems work, right? And it kind of becomes the foundation to this day of a lot of what you do. Can you just briefly sketch what that is?
Well, the kind of work that I got interested in when I started first getting interested in art, way before I was making my own paintings, way before I went to art school, was by a generation of artists in Sri Lanka who kind of since the 90s have been sort of influenced by the Western canon, but kind of reinterpreting that canon from a Sri Lankan perspective and in relation to particular kind of histories of war and conflict that they were living through at the time. And I kind of, I don't know, viscerally related to their work without knowing anything about it. And then at art school, being into that stuff was like very not cool because
it's kind of it's not representation. It's like painting. Goldsmiths, for people who don't know, is kind of a conceptual art bastion. You know, a lot of the famously young British artists came from it. Yeah, like you were studying like Suhail Malik, like high theory. It's not really theory-driven art. It's like almost like expressionist painting. Is that how you describe it?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a prehistory that you could describe like that. But then this generation of artists in the 90s started thinking more expansively about the forms that art could take. And we're working in all kinds of mediums, but certainly not what was cool to be into at Goldsmiths at that time. And doing that work that you mentioned, Ben, it was for me a way of kind of coming to terms with the gap between where my family is from and where I was at that point, and also kind of doing that in a way that didn't paper over those differences. And I didn't want to engage in this kind of cultural exchange, collaboration kind of thing. I just bought the work of some of those artists with the very modest budget that I had for my degree show, which was like $1,000, I think. And I bought a couple of these works and then incorporated those original artworks by other artists in my installation, which was a way of doing things that I kind of kept doing after art school for a few years up until, let's say, 2019 or so.
Almost like a provocation, like buying artworks from Sri Lanka, incorporating it into your own artwork as like almost like a found object, and then sort of showing that relationship as the work of art. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of interested in the idea that as those artists who were kind of well known at the time, and I believed would become kind of crossover international successes, I was interested in how my work might sort of economically rip itself apart as those artworks that I was able to buy quite affordably at the time became more valuable. So there was that kind of economic upcycling, downcycling dimension to it as well.
It is like a provocation, this work. This is what I want to get to. It's like a provocation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so what's the reaction from those artists?
I don't have any relationship with those artists, and I didn't want to. It wasn't about a collaboration. It was about
the unequal relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I also stopped working in that way when the power dynamics reversed, or at least when my work became more visible. I started doing that for my degree show when those artists were like the biggest artists that I was interested in. And I kind of stopped working in that way when my work became like visible on a par with their work, because then it kind of changed how it felt for me.
Oh, that's interesting. That's actually an aspect of it that I've never thought about, that you were, although it was about the dynamics between the West and the periphery, if you want to call that, it was also about the dynamics between an art student and like working artists.
And the heroes, yeah. All of my work sort of is metabolistic in one way or another. I channel the work of a lot of other artists, and including the work that's on now that I think you have seen, Ben. It's always my heroes.
So I want to get to the contemporary work because there's so much to talk about that. Before we do, there's one more thing I think we need to get at, because it goes through your entire thread of work, is that moment in 2009. Politically, there's something going on, a conversation that you're interested in that surfaces in all the work I've seen at MoMA, in Gagosian, the one that'll be at the new museum. There is a specific conversation about the role of contemporary art in politics and in the economics and the political moment in 2009, 2012, when you're in art school, that you're thinking about, right?
I mean, what was happening for me was I was seeing from a distance how a conflict that I had sort of grown up with back home ended in the most brutal way that I could have imagined. And then it was super weird seeing how, in the kind of opening up of the Sri Lankan economy that followed the end of that war, how the first sort of Western-style contemporary art galleries opened, and the biennial and
the Colombo Art Biennial, yeah. It appears in your work, yeah.
Which no longer exists. But these things happened in the immediate aftermath of what more and more people are recognizing was a genocide. And being far away from that and starting to study art for the first time, I guess I was just wanting to kind of figure out what art was doing in the world.
Yeah. And what conclusion did you draw that it was doing?
Turned out to be not such a simple question.
Okay. Well, let's get into the complexity. I mean, I guess, in my opinion, almost some of these works are like you working through that, or like almost like manifesto artworks about that.
I don't think they can be manifestos because I don't know the answer. Like maybe you could see them as sort of hypotheses or something.
Well, you've been, for instance, critical of the kind of performance of identity in contemporary art. I think that starts with that early work.
Right.
Which is maybe counterintuitive to some people who have seen a lot of contemporary art that's very much kind of trying to teach you a nice, neat lesson about like the history of colonialism. You know, that's a very important topic in contemporary art right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, it seems to me that your way of thinking almost reverses that kind of conversation, where there's a lot of art that's trying to give you a window into a historical moment of the West's domination of other cultures and kind of maybe make you feel like you've learned something. And to you, I think the lesson you drew from this moment of contemporary art in Sri Lanka and your experience in art school is more the opposite, that kind of humanist gesture is two-faced or cynical. And you're really more like want to point that out.
Yeah, but I mean, I have no personal beef with any individual artist on that particular grift. But what happens systemically when you have this kind of situation where everyone knows that all you have to do is perform an authenticity to your minority identity in the most kind of simple and legible way possible. Like what happens systemically is that you end up with a reduced set of possibilities about who we can be. Yeah, certainly in my work, I don't know, I guess I feel something of an obligation or duty or something to inhabit my own kind of identity in a way that opens up possibilities or complicates the kind of reductive narratives about what that can be, perhaps.
So let's talk about your work that was recently at Gagosian, which is called Peacecore. It has two components. It's a complex work. Just explain it very briefly.
Yeah, so Peacecore is the name of the exhibition and also the name of an artwork in that show.
Oh, Peacecore Sphere, yeah.
Yeah. And the show also features a series of paintings as well as this 24-screen video installation of infinite duration.
Which is like a sphere of screens that just plays this continuous footage. It's very hypnotic.
And it's all footage that was broadcast on American television on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001. All of it is from that morning. Most of it is from the 5.5 minutes between when the first plane flew into the first World Trade Center tower and when it showed up on TV. So you never see what happens next. It's all from those kind of final moments of innocence, perhaps. And that's what I find so, I don't know, perversely compelling about that footage, why I can't stop watching it, is because it has this sense of innocence that feels like it's from another world. And it's a world that I remember because I was at school at the time. And if you were alive in the West during that preceding decade, you could probably, believe in this idea that history had ended and that liberal democracy would prevail forever and ever and bring peace and happiness to all of humanity. And of course, that was a fiction, but it was, one that I believed in when I was a kid, growing up in London. And yeah, something that I would never have been able to imagine when I was watching those planes fly into those buildings was that the knock-on effect would be that where my family is from would cease to exist. But that's kind of how that went down.
Because it's the beginning of the war on terror, and that becomes, much bigger than that event. It becomes it's used as a justification for the elimination of Muslim peoples in the north of Sri Lanka.
Well, yeah, and Hindu people, Tamil people. The narrative of the war on terror gave Sri Lanka's president at the time the pretext to reframe the Tamil liberation movement as a terrorist organization and then genocide them. And the paintings in the show are paintings that are somewhat unusual for me in that they're historically specific, and they are paintings of the most haunted place that I've ever been, which is a narrow strip of beach in a place called Mullavikal in the northeast coast of what is now Sri Lanka, where in the final stages of the war there, something like 100,000 Tamil civilians were marshaled onto this narrow peninsula, this beach that was made into this no-fire zone, and that safe zone was made smaller and smaller and smaller, and then bombed. And nobody really knows how many people were killed that day because there were no outside witnesses. The United Nations were required to leave the country before that happened, and foreign journalists weren't allowed back in for a long time. So these paintings are not painted from photographic evidence. They're imagined the same way that I compose all of my paintings, using neural networks that I train on the work of successive generations of artists in Sri Lanka who have been influenced by the Western canon. And then I use that to generate new compositions. And all of those paintings are paintings of these digital images.
So in that sense, these are paintings that use the styles of these Sri Lankan artists, similar to the artists from the earlier work that you appropriated to illustrate this historical event. You said you started out sort of engineering thinker, you're a systems thinker, you think about art as systems, and there is a continuity between this earlier mode of appropriation and thinking about the circulation of art between nodes in the art system and your use of AI now. What is the connection? Like, how do you move from this one way of thinking to this other way of thinking using artificial intelligence as the basis for these paintings? Because they're hand-painted paintings that the images are inspired by this sort of synthesis of images from neural networks.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about using these kinds of tools, and I've been using AI tools in my work for most of the last decade, originally like GANs and then the first LLMs and now all kinds of transformer models. And I kind of like being able to compress a huge amount of influences from beyond just myself. And I particularly love it when people recognize things in my paintings that they describe in great detail, but that I don't even know is there. And so, I come to see this way of making things as being about kind of channeling a network in a way, channeling a sort of collective consciousness or something like that.
I mean, you're very critical of contemporary art's idea of the individual, the idea of sort of selling an individual's authenticity. In some of your videos and writing, you describe contemporary art as a universal, non-specific, non-genre. The kind of contemporary art that was being introduced into Sri Lanka, where it's this kind of cosmopolitan, universal art where every artist can be everything. And it almost seems to me like part of the appeal to you of artificial intelligence as a tool is that it kind of realizes that idea of contemporary art as expression that's coming from everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, and also the kind of painting that my paintings are influenced by through the work of a few generations of artists in Sri Lanka and the canon from the West that they have been influenced by, is a particular kind of history of art that I think is hardwired with a particular idea of what it means to be human.
Which is what?
That's based on this idea of the individual, this idea of our individual free will as liberated, autonomous individuals. And it's an idea that is specific to our civilization. Our civilization is the only one on the planet at this point that believes in this particular idea.
Our being what? What's the our there?
Oh, the civilization of the West. In a way, that idea is the kind of foundational psyop of that civilization. It's the fiction that makes everything else go round. It's the basis of our economic system, our political system, our culture. And it's an idea that has been concretized into the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it's kind of the ideological front line of an empire. And on the one hand, I'm kind of infatuated with that idea. I think it's one of the greatest stories ever told, and it's kind of awe-inspiring how pervasive it is. But the thing about growing up between different cultures is that it makes it easier to see through all of them. And I think a part of me has maybe never entirely believed in that fiction. And I think more broadly, I think it's a set of ideas that is perhaps unraveling anyway, not just with these new technologies, but also in a shift in the balance of power from the so-called West to the so-called East.
These ideas all continue to come up in the work that is currently on view in the Museum of Modern Art permanent collection, Being Human, which I sat through several times yesterday, and in the work, The Finesse, that will be at this new museum show, both of which retell the story of the Sri Lankan genocide and revisit Sri Lanka and that moment of contemporary art that we're talking about, and then also have these AI elements that they incorporate. The one at the Museum of Modern Art has an AI Taylor Swift. The one that is at the new museum has an AI Kim Kardashian, among other things, and sort of speak both about that political history and the technological moment. So you're bringing together this critique of Western doublespeak about individuality and an embrace of digital networks and a new form of digital creativity. Is that right? It's somehow about all bringing about the idea of authenticity into question, correct?
Yeah, it's a hot mess. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, maybe start by just give us your description as concisely as you can of what's going on in Being Human at MoMA.
Well, that video installation, it takes place during the Colombo Art Biennial, which we've already mentioned, and kind of looks at this relationship between human rights, if you see that juridical framework as the legal expression of a certain set of so-called liberal, so-called democratic values from the West, looks at the relationship between that juridical framework and the aesthetic expression of those same set of values in contemporary art. And it looks at this relationship through the prism of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the work kind of began, in a way, it came out of this ongoing debate I've been having with my uncle, who makes a little appearance in that work. He's the older person.
Who used to run a human rights center?
Yeah, he's a bit of a family hero. He was the last of my family to leave because he was headmaster of a school and wanted to stay to protect his students in Jaffna from the Sri Lankan army. He used funding from the Catholic Church to set up and run this human rights center to investigate government war crimes, which unsurprisingly the Sri Lankan government didn't really enjoy. So they tried to assassinate him several times. And he's kind of the luckiest person I know. Like the first time they tried to kill him, he got up in the middle of the night to go to the loo and a bomb landed in his bed. That's the kind of luck he has. And that's how he knows that someone up there is looking after him. He used to live with us in London when he was doing his doctoral research on human rights. And he and I more recently had been having this kind of ongoing debate about that legal framework that he's relied on for his activist work, but that he also, on another level, kind of understands as this kind of, what I described a second ago as this kind of ideological front line of an empire from the West. So, yeah, the work kind of, I think, started from that discussion.
So the work very explicitly has the subjects in it basically propose, based on this political experience in Sri Lanka. It's interesting to see at MoMA, which is like this temple of modernism and this video arrives at towards the end of their permanent collection, towards their story of art. And I almost see it as like a Trojan horse in this museum. It is, to me, you said it's not a manifesto, but I think the argument's pretty clear in it, that it's like a post-liberal argument. That you have this explicit argument being made by one of the figures in the document that real democracy isn't about elections. Real democracy is about being able to choose between different systems. Like basically the idea that the West's idea of democratic freedom is a lie. And I think it's specifically making an argument that we should give that up. Yeah?
You were describing it as a Trojan horse, and I don't know if it's exactly a Trojan horse in that I'm sure that's...
I just mean that I'm not sure that it feels like they know what they've got there.
No, certainly that's why everyone involved at the museum is interested in it, I think, as this kind of meta-reflection on what a collection is. I think they certainly know what they've got. But certainly, yeah, that's kind of why I find it interesting to have that work in a collection that has historically been part of that kind of soft power operation, for sure.
Yeah, so you have in the gallery where you see it, you have, again, these works of art that are sort of syntheses using AI of these expressionist styles that draw on a certain history of Sri Lankan art, but they're like not real, or they're like your paintings that are produced at a synthesis with that. And then you have intercut into this video, this AI Taylor Swift, who holds forth on authenticity, about authenticity is the most important commodity. And of course, that's all very ironic, because I assume, that you didn't get her permission to use her likeness for this work. These are your syntheses of other styles from the canon that you're just using. And that is you basically being like, we should give up that idea of authenticity. Like, that's just a fiction, a useful fiction that people have, the fiction of the individual style.
Well, that's kind of the idea that the Taylor Swift character articulates, I think, in the work, where she's making the argument that if performing your own authenticity is the price of admission for everyone, right, then what does it mean?
Yeah. Well, but I've read you say, I guess I've come to feel pretty relaxed about where the so-called individual ends and where everything else begins, the ecology, the flow, whatever. What does it mean to be a post-individual artist, to give up that idea?
I don't think it's such a big deal because, like I said, we are the only civilization on this planet that thinks that way. And for our civilization, I would like to see us get a bit more comfortable with other civilizations living by their own values, even if we're not into those values. I think we haven't had to think like that when we could have believed at one point historically that our values were a moral good in themselves and therefore universal. But I don't think that way of thinking is going to be viable for them.
So the new museum show that you're in is called New Humans. It's about technology and the idea of the human and artists who work to create new ideas of humanity at the edge of technology or post-humanity. Your MoMA show is explicitly about the idea of letting go of the state and the individual. And I do feel like, yeah, there's something about your work that, I mean, it comes from this very serious history of experience of Western double standards, colonial double standards, that it resonates with the thing that's going on in culture, a sort of a post-liberal moment, this kind of disillusion with that I'm not sure that the gatekeepers of culture realize how deep that goes. You know, the kind of just deep disillusion with the idea that culture as it exists offers a future. I mean, you see that a lot in the crypto world and the NFT. Young people who are just like, this world is not offering me a future, so I just need to go build my own future with whatever tools are available. You're a rare artist who's explicitly kind of like a post-liberal artist in that sense. I mean, and I'm looking at your work in all these flagship places of contemporary art. It's something you've said, you know, contemporary art always produces the art it needs. And I'm just wondering, does the Christopher Kulendran Thomas moment, does that symbolize a kind of like a post-liberal disillusion going mainstream within the culture industries? What do you think?
I don't know. That sounds like your job, Ben, to figure that out. But I can say, in terms of my own work,
I'm doing my best.
I feel very optimistic in a weird way, maybe perversely, about all of the kind of shifts that we're talking about. And I guess a kind of related question is about the scale of transformation that we might be at the very beginning of. If we're only talking about AI, never mind anything else, but we can talk about everything else as well. But my mental model for thinking about the scale of transformation involved is by looking at historical examples of technological platform shifts. And I like thinking about AI in relation to the arrival of the printing press, which kind of changed the economics of communication. In that before the printing press, you had to train a priest, which is quite expensive, and a priest could reach, like, let's say, I don't know, 1,000, 10,000 people, whatever. But the printing press cost even more money than to train a priest, right? The upfront fixed cost was much greater. But once you'd spent that money, the marginal cost of every additional 1,000 or 10,000 newspapers or whatever was way less than the marginal cost of training every additional priest. So the economics of that technology makes sense when you have a larger population that can speak the same language. And so that kind of leads to all of these initiatives to unify languages around an emerging organizational form of the nation state, which it turns out is a really good environment for a market economy. When you have a bunch of people organized the same way, you can speak the same language and communicate the same way. And then when you have this like newly literate population, you need a new kind of political system. So you have the idea of a representative democracy as a kind of minimum viable simulation of interactivity to maintain order amongst that kind of newly literate population. So all of these hugely important institutions, the nation state, capitalism, democracy, all enabled by reducing the marginal cost of broadcasting information. And I think an important question for everyone to think about is whether reducing the marginal cost of intelligence or reasoning is a smaller or bigger deal than reducing the marginal cost of broadcasting information. I think it might turn out to be a bigger deal. And so I think it's only reasonable to assume that the scale of transformation involved will be at least on the scale of the nation state, capitalism, and democracy. And so all of that is just by way of saying that I think anything is possible. And
well, I want to ask you about what are the possibilities? I mean, I think this is a very explicit subtext and even text of your work, is that like we're moving towards new ideas of the human, new humans, and there are new humans possible because of this technology. Of course, when you bring up the printing press example, it is also true that the advent of the printing press both created nation states and the possibility of national imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson said, but then also, centuries of very brutal wars, and like a lot of negative consequences flowed from the unleashing of that information. And I really wish sometimes people would not treat that as just like a necessary side effect, but as an actual historical lesson to learn from. A thing that we got out of the printing press is written history, so we can look at that history and learn some lessons about how to do this better. You are someone who's thinking very explicitly about this. I mean, I think you basically believe that in art and society, we should move towards something people might call a networked state, yeah?
I think that term is used by people...
The Silicon Valley kind of right-wing term, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm quite interested in maybe a different approach to the question of what comes after nation states. And I think buried in the Hall of Mirrors, that is the finesse, the work that would be on at the New Museum, is something of a proposition, or at least a hypothesis, so a sort of bet on history in a way. And we can talk about that work as well. But this hunch or hypothesis that's in that work is, as markets are decentralized beyond the control of ruling elites, markets will produce increasingly cooperative economic models. Why? Because using something that you collectively co-own is a better deal than using something that is owned only by somebody else. So my hunch is that decentralized markets will produce internet scale cooperatives. Like genuinely free markets will produce a post-capitalist economy. Free market communism, if you will. And I don't know that is how things will go, but that's the possibility that I'm interested in. And I think when you massively reduce the cost of reasoning and therefore the coordination of manufacturing and logistics and the cost of digging fossil fuels out of the ground, replaced with renewable energy, I think you remove the constraints on an economy that is entirely based on constraint. What we call capitalism is about the scarcity of those resources. And I think overcoming those constraints is a fundamentally different kind of economy. And, you were talking about new humans before the printing press, before the nation state, before capitalism, before democracy, before all of the institutions that defined this way of understanding ourselves as individuals. It would have been impossible for somebody to think of themselves in that way. Like, who we think we are now would have been unimaginable for someone before those institutions made that way of thinking possible. So I think, the future of our species will be unimaginable to us now. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I find incredibly interesting about the theses of that show.
What's the difference between the positive and the negative outcomes of that new civilization on the horizon? I mean, in a certain sense, people, I think, might view you as a kind of a cynical artist. Like, you've drawn some cynical conclusions from these traumatic political experiences and just empirical observation of the art world. And there's everything to be cynical about. But in a certain sense, you're very optimistic about technology, much less cynical than most people are. And many people, myself included, look at this world technological order being assembled and kind of see, the pieces of a dystopia being made where you don't have a lot of options. You don't have a lot of individual rights or abilities to choose as an individual. So what for you, in terms of this new technological horizon that's being created, makes the difference between the good and the bad outcomes for artists, for everyone else? Will people get those answers at the new museum?
I'm certainly not oblivious to the dystopian scenarios and for me, what that looks like is AI is regulated as a state monopoly. I've been particularly interested to see over the last few years how the biggest AI labs have embraced the doomer discourse on the existential risk of AI. And of course they have, because if they can dramatize that risk and get the technology regulated, they will be the ones writing the regulations and the only ones able to afford to comply with the regulations. And I think if open source foundation models are regulated out of existence, then you will have an unprecedented capability to control reality concentrated in the hands of a small number of corporations and states. And I think that's what a dystopian scenario looks like for me. I don't spend that much time worrying about a Skynet apocalypse extincting us all, not because I don't think it can't happen, but because I think that there are a lot of ways that our species could be extincted. I think there are a lot of ways that any species can be wiped out all the time that we don't think about. And I'm particularly interested in how the particular risks that we do worry about, how those risks get narrated and why and for whose benefit. But I think, the work at the New Museum tells the story of a much older technology. It tells the story of the Tamil liberation movement discovering the potential of the World Wide Web when Sri Lanka got its first internet service provider in 1995. And the liberation tigers of Tamil Elam were very quick to see the potential of the internet, not just to circumvent government censorship, but also to coordinate the Tamil diaspora around the world. And in the mid-90s, they set up a division called the Internet Black Tigers. And they developed this globally distributed identity protocol that became the basis of a kind of parallel economy around the world, where they levied taxes to fund the liberation movement back home. And that identity protocol was the basis of your access to the autonomous state of Tamil Elam. It was a kind of, using the term you used before, Ben, it was a kind of proto-network state in a way. And I'm kind of interested in these lost histories that didn't get to play out because they're also like sci-fis. They're a way of glimpsing an alternate possible reality. And, that stuff is so different to what the mainstream of Silicon Valley was doing at the time. So in a way, that work is kind of, I guess, a sci-fi about another possible internet, but told through the prism of this liberation movement discovering the potential of Web 1.
But isn't the reason it didn't work out like power, like who had power? And why would that be different with AI? I mean, just to make it concrete for the artistic question, I mean, I think, isn't it kind of easy to give up artistic individuality and so on when you're treated like an individual already? Like, I mean, wouldn't you feel bad if someone was ripping off your stuff?
I don't know, Ben. I would feel flattered. I think, I think it's very specific to our field, right? I think in other fields, you remix stuff all the time. You metabolize stuff all the time. It's how music works. It's how lots of other things work. And I think the art world, as it has been constructed, is definitely constructed around this idea of the individual artist as this kind of heroic figure, and also around ideas about originality and contemporaneity and aesthetic innovation, all of these things that I think should be up for grabs. But no, if people remixing my work, fucking with my work, being influenced by my work, I think that's what the working looks like.
All right. Well, Christopher Kulendran Thomas, thank you very much for having these very challenging conversations.
Ben, so good talking with you.
The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.